Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, my dear students. Now, in our previous lecture, we started talking about the first of the four major problems faced in macroeconomics, the problem of unemployment. We defined unemployment, we saw how it was measured, what it meant. We looked at some costs of unemployment, both at the private, that is individual level, and at the social level. We then analyzed the different theories about the causes of unemployment. We looked at Keynesian theories, classical theories, and the monetarist or natural rate of unemployment theory. And then we suggested solutions to the problem of unemployment and the different types of unemployment that were identified. Now note that we followed a very systematic approach in our discussion. We started by defining the problem, then looking at why the problem was important to us, that is by looking at the costs. Then we looked at the various options or the various options that were available to us for understanding or getting to the root of the problem, what was causing the problem. And then finally, we looked at solutions. The point I'm trying to drive home is that it is very easy to get emotional about issues, and macroeconomic issues are often very easy to get emotional about because they surround all of us. They are all over the place. They surround us in society. Inflation, unemployment, the lack of growth or productive activity, balance of payments problems, they are in the news every day. They are on television, in the radio, right? So it's very easy to get emotional about these problems, but it's important to be intelligent about how one approaches these problems. And the approach economists take is, in my opinion, a very intelligent one. They try to dissect the issue fully, get to the root of what is causing the problem, and then find appropriate solutions for the type of problem or the reason or the nature of the cause for unemployment. If the cause is demand deficiency, then the policy solution would be to have or inject more demand. If the problem is higher wages or sticky wages downwards, then the answer would be to relax or make wages more flexible. But if the problem was a natural rate unemployment, then we needed to close the gaps between the AJ and the LF curves. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on a recap because I think we covered the issues in quite a lot of detail in our previous lecture. But the main things to remember there are the different types of unemployment that can exist, the distinction between voluntary and involuntary unemployment, the implication of that distinction on the costs of unemployment, the world that you are operating in, whether it's a recession or a recessionary world that you're operating in, whether it's a full employment world that you're operating in, that will drastically change the policy suggestion that you will put forward for solving the problem of unemployment. Now, there was one last thing that was left in our discussion of unemployment, and that was how can one explain persistent unemployment? Not in a Keynesian world. I mean, Keynesian unemployment, that is when there is deficiency of demand and that you move permanently away from the full employment level because of the interaction between firms' expectations and consumers' spending on goods and services. We're not talking about that. Generally, how do you explain persistent unemployment when the demand deficiency is not such a big problem? That is, the demand deficiency is at least not permanent. When you're talking about a temporary demand deficiency which is then cured. And even then, sometimes you see the persistence of unemployment in an economy. How do you explain such things? The answer to such questions, and such questions have been very relevant in many Western European countries in the last decade, where there has been persistent unemployment in countries like Germany and France. And while there are some classical and Keynesian arguments for this persistence in unemployment, people say that the main reason for persistent unemployment in, let's say, the European Union is hysteresis. Hysteresis is a concept or a view which says that temporary changes in some variables can cause permanent changes in the affected variables. Let me give you a simple example. When we were doing our demand-supply analysis, both in microeconomics and in macroeconomics, we talked about shifts in the demand curve, right? And we talked about shifts in the demand curve as if they were totally independent from shifts in the supply curve, right? But in reality, it could be possible that when there are shifts in the demand curve, there could be shifts in the supply curve as well. That is, a change in demand or tastes or whatever has an effect on the supply side as well. That is, there is a shift in the supply curve as well. And it is entirely possible that when the demand change, that the initial demand change which shifted demand to the right disappears, then the supply change that occurred would not disappear. That is, the temporary change in demand causes a permanent change in supply. A temporary shift in the demand curve causes a permanent shift in the supply curve. Let's illustrate how this would work for the labor market. That is, how a temporary decline in demand for labor could cause a permanent shift in the supply of labor and could move the economy into a state of persistent or permanent unemployment. Let's look at a graph. Now let's look at this simple graph where you have the real wage on the vertical axis and the level of employment on the horizontal axis, the typical labor market graph that we've been talking about. We have the JA curve and the LD curve, and they intersect at point E. Now imagine the effect of a leftward shift in the labor demand curve due to some recessionary changes or some other factor. That is, firms suddenly demand less labor. The LD curve shifts to the left. Now if over time the LD curve were to shift back to its original place, that is, back from LD prime to LD, then equilibrium would shift back to point E from point G. But note what happens when you have hysteresis effects of the initial fall in demand. One kind of hysteresis effect could be that as demand falls, workers become used to being unemployed. That is, when the initial demand fall takes place and workers are laid off or have problems in finding employment, then over time they might develop a habit for unemployment. That is, they might become lazy, they might become disheartened, they might not have the same inspiration to look for jobs as they had earlier. And the effect of all of these factors would be to shift the JA curve inwards, right? So the JA curve would now shift to JA prime. Now imagine what would happen if the labor demand curve shifted back to LD. That is, the initial fall in demand was reversed. Now you would not move back to point E, but equilibrium would move to point F, that is below the full employment level. This is one way in which you could explain an economy settling at a permanently lower level of employment than the full employment level. Now the economy can settle at a point F not only because of the laziness or disheartedness of laborers or workers once they get used to not finding jobs. It can also be the way in which firms behave once they have been through a spell of low hiring. That is, if firms have a lot of vacancies and they can't fill them, that is, they get used to having less than the full employment level of people working for them, then it might be that firms don't advertise those vacancies once they are generated. And all of this leads to a lower level of unemployment than would have existed if firms and laborers had the same behavior after this initial small spell of recession than if they do not have this new kind of behavior. Similarly, you can think of firms moving to a lower level of capital stock, because once a recession sets in, there is a fall in demand, then firms' demand for investment falls. And as they have low and low investment year after year, their capital stock falls. Now, you know what the effect of a low capital stock is on the marginal productivity of capital. When the capital to labor ratio falls because of the firms not investing over time, the marginal productivity of capital relative to the marginal productivity of labor increases. And that is, whenever firms do want to expand again, they first start by hiring more capital, that is, expanding their capital stock, not hiring more labor. So it's such permanent behavior, such permanent behavioral changes on the part of workers and firms which can cause hysteresis effects. That is, the permanent effect induced by a temporary demand fall or a temporary effect. In this case, it was the fall in demand which caused a reduction in the supply of labor because of laborers offering themselves less and less for new jobs. But as I said, there could be other reasons on the part of firms. Permanently lower firms' demand could also be one way in which hysteresis effects can manifest. So hysteresis has been an important way in which economists have explained persistent unemployment episodes in Europe. The next topic for our discussion is inflation. This is the second major macroeconomic problem that besets economists. And inflation is defined as the rate of change in prices. We've been talking about the price level in our discussion on GDP, and when we were talking about how to measure GDP and how to differentiate nominal GDP from real GDP. Well, inflation is simply the rate of change of the price level. And we said that the price level was usually a price index. We'll come to what complications the choice of this price index creates. Some people would like a certain price index to be chosen. Some people would like a certain price index to be chosen. But abstracting away from that, pure inflation, which does not get affected by the choice of index that one uses, pure inflation is a situation in which the prices of all the goods and services in the economy rise by the same rate. So if you have, let's say, 3 goods in the economy, apples, mangoes, and bananas, and each apple costs 5 rupees, mango costs 10 rupees, and banana costs 15 rupees. In a hypothetical economy, those might not be the relative prices. But if you have these 5, 10, and 15 prices of these 3 goods, then if you said that pure inflation is 50%, then the apple's price would rise to 7.5, the mango's price would rise to 15, and the banana's price would rise to 22.5. So pure inflation has the effect of raising all the prices in the economy by the same rate. Generally, however, inflation is simply defined as the change in the price index this year, the change this year compared to last year divided by the index last year multiplied by 100. Note that inflation is a flow concept. Prices are a stock concept. So the price level is a stock figure. That is, it is the prices prevailing at any point in time. Whereas inflation is a flow concept. It is the difference. It's related to the difference in the price levels. And this is the same distinction as we made earlier. Note that in the context of costs and revenues, we had total costs at any time. Then we had the concept of marginal cost, which was the change between total costs. We also had the case of deposits. There was the total stock of deposits, and then the change in deposits. That was a flow concept. So the same applies here. The price level is a stock concept. Inflation is a flow concept. Let's look at this distinction through a simple example. Now, as I mentioned, inflation is simply defined as the difference in the price level prevailing today compared to that prevailing, let's say, last year, divided by the starting price level. So it can be represented as PT, minus pt minus 1 over pt minus 1, all multiplied by 100, where p stands for price and t is the time subscript. Now, if you set up a table for a hypothetical economy and we have the price levels given, we can compute inflation very easily from there. So let's say if we have the price level information for an economy at 4 different dates, that is at 30th June 2000, 30th June 2001, 30th June 2002, and 30th June 2003. As you know, this is also the year ending, the fiscal year ending for many economies, including Pakistan. Anyway, the price level data that we have corresponding to these 4 dates is 100, 105, 107, and 120. And the inflation calculation can simply be done by combining any 2 pairs. So you have 105 minus 100 over 100, which gives 5%. This would be the inflation prevailing between 1st July 2000 and 30th June 2001. Similarly, for the next fiscal year, you would have, that is fiscal year 2001-2002, you would have inflation equal to 1.9%. And for fiscal year 2002-2003, inflation would be 12.1%. Now, three important things to note when we talk about the meaning and measurement of inflation. We've seen how inflation is calculated. We'll go into the depths of the measurement issue in a little while. But just at the outset, let me mention that generally an inflation rate of above 10% is considered high or bad, not good, whereas an inflation rate of between 5 to 10% is usually considered acceptable for fast-growing lower-income countries or developing countries, whereas developed or advanced economies usually have inflation rates between 3 and 4% or below that. So those are the typical inflation rates and what they generally mean to economists. Anything above 10%, which is called double-digit inflation, is dangerous. Single-digit inflation is relatively more acceptable. Now, about the measurement of inflation, it's a big problem because inflation depends, the calculation of inflation depends on the goods that you include in your basket, right? I gave you the example of mangoes, bananas, and oranges, but there could be any number of goods in the economy. How many goods should the government take in calculating the price index, right? We've been talking about the price index as if this thing already exists out there. But from a government's point of view, the decision still has to be made as to which goods to include and which to not include, whether only to include mangoes, oranges, and bananas, or whether to include computers, cars, machinery, etc. Now, ideally, there should be all the goods that are produced in the economy. But that's not an easy task, right? And sometimes it's not relevant either. So, for example, if you are a student, you would be more interested or more worried about the rate of change of prices of goods and services that are relevant to you. So as a student, what is important to you? Well, the prices of books are important to you, the prices of stationery are important to you, the price of schooling or going to college is important to you. Public transport prices might also be important to you. So you could make your own student price index, which could be the most relevant price index for you. Then if you look at patients who want to get health services, then the price index which would be most relevant for them could be called a health price index, which includes the price of getting medical tests done, the prices of medicines, the price of doctors, the fees that they charge, the price of getting operated upon. So the health price index would have a different basket of goods and services from the student price index. Similarly, some people, if you wanted to look at only the impact of food prices on the people's consumption of food, then you might want to talk about the food price index. And you include the basic foods there, that is wheat, rice, the price of cooking oil, etc., etc. So that could be another price index that could be of relevance. Similarly, there could be a broader consumer price index where all the items that consumers final households eventually consume can be lumped together, given the appropriate weights depending on how much of those goods are consumed in the economy. And then you could come up with a price index which reflects the changes in prices which are most relevant to consumers. It's called the CPI. Often this is the most popular index which is used for prices. But there could also be the producer price index, the PPI. That is an index of all the prices which are important for firms and businesses. The price of electricity, the price of rental price of capital, the rental price of buildings, the cost of wages, the cost of raw materials, the cost of inputs. So all of those costs could be relevant to producers, and they could come up with the producer price index. Believe it or not, all these different indices do exist. Now, so whenever you hear as to what the inflation rate is, be careful as to what the underlying index is that is being used to compute inflation. It might well be that somebody says that the consumer price index has gone down, that is, there has been deflation in the economy. Whereas you find that student prices or the prices that are relevant to students have gone up. So it's possible for individual components of the overall CPI to have different signs, to move in different directions. It's possible for food prices to be rising and consumer durable prices to be falling. And you see it around you. Computer prices have fallen over the last 10 years drastically, whereas food prices have constantly been on the up. So it's very important to know which price index is being talked about. Now, it's also useful to distinguish between all the consumer price indices. So the student price index, food price index, health price index, these are all examples of prices which are important to households, the consumption sector. To differentiate between those and the producer price index, which is relevant for the supply side of the economy, that is for firms who are involved in the production of goods and services. The most relevant rate of inflation for the producers or firms is often the wage inflation. How fast are wages rising? Fine, other inputs are also important, the price of electricity and raw materials, etc., and capital. But the rate at which wages rise is often important, very important for firms and the producer sector in general. So we need to distinguish between the rate of increase in prices of goods and services and the rate of increase in the prices of factors of production, of which labor is just an example. So the rate of inflation of factor prices and the inflation rate for goods prices. So let's talk a little bit more about the particular factor that we focused on, that is labor. The difference between wage inflation and price inflation. Now, the difference between these two types of inflation is important not only for firms, but also for workers themselves, because it is the relationship between wage inflation and general price inflation which determines whether real wages in any economy, that is, wages adjusted for price changes, are increasing or falling. Note that if real wages are increasing, it's good for the workers because the purchasing power is increasing. But it's not good for firms because wages are a cost to firms. So if the real wages go up, then the real cost of hiring labor increases for firms. The simple relationship between real wage inflation, sort of wage inflation and price inflation is that if wage inflation is greater than price inflation, that is, if wages are rising faster than the rate at which prices are rising, then the real wages will be rising. That is, the purchasing power of people will be increasing. Whereas if the wage inflation rate is less than the price inflation rate, then the real wage will be falling. That is, the purchasing power of workers will be falling. I'll give you a simple example. If you earned rupees 100 in this period and you consumed goods equivalent to rupees 100, right? In the next period, if the price of those same goods that you consumed or bought for rupees 100 rises to 120, that is, the price of that bundle of goods rises from rupees 100 to 120, a 20% increase, but your wages only increased by 10%, that is, your wages went up from 100 to 110, then would your purchasing power would have increased or fallen? Certainly, your purchasing power, your ability to buy goods and services has fallen because you now cannot buy the same bundle of goods that you could have bought earlier. Now, you can imagine why it is very important to keep the rates at which wages and prices are rising at similar levels. Because if real wages fall too much, then people's purchasing power will be eroded, and then people obviously will not be as happy. And this has happened in many developing countries. Similarly, if wages rise too fast, that is, if they rise faster than prices, then real wages can increase, and while that will be good for consumers, but that will be bad for firms. So ideally, in an economy, real wages should be constant, only growing with the rate of growth of real GDP. But some countries in the world which have very high inflation rates, let's say countries in Latin America, South America, which have often experienced rates of inflation, price inflation of 50%, 100%, even higher, it becomes difficult to make sure that wages will automatically rise as fast as prices are rising. And there is a real chance that wages might fall below the rate at which the rate of change of wages might fall below the rate of increase of prices, because the rate of increase of prices is so high. We're not talking about 15% inflation or 10% inflation. We're talking about 100% inflation. That is, the prices of things moving by 10 to 12% every month, or 8 to 10% every month. In that case, some governments have adopted the index-linked approach to setting wages. That is, wages are index-linked in those economies. When you say index-linked, that means that wages are linked to the price index. So as soon as the prices go up, wages also go up. If prices go up by 10%, wages also go up by 10%. This index linking is embedded in the contracts that wages sign with their employers. And this is a major feature of high inflation countries where there is a real risk of purchasing power of workers being eroded. Now, the difficulty of keeping real wages constant in any economy is not only relevant for countries where the inflation rate is very high, like the Latin American countries. It can also arise in countries like Pakistan, which have experienced moderate rates of inflation, but that the rate of increase in wages has not been able to keep pace with the rate of increase in prices. That is, if prices have increased by, let's say, 6 or 7% annually for the last 20, 30 years, then wages have only increased on average by 1 to 2%. So when you compound the effect over a period of 20 to 30 years of these differential growth rates, differential rates of increase, the effects can become very huge indeed. For example, there was a private survey which was done which said that the purchasing power of a salaried person has now deteriorated by 90% compared to what it was in the 1960s. So within a period of 30 years, 90% of the purchasing power of a salaried person or average salaried person decreasing is a huge effect. Often the fall in real wages has very negative implications in terms of the efficiency of the workers, especially in the government sector, and can lead to an increase in corruption and ways of making money which are not legal. And these are all indeed problems that Pakistan and other developing countries faced. So real wage stability is pretty important. मुझे यहाँ एक वाकया भी याद आ रहा है कि हबीब जालिब साहब का एक शेर है जो उन्होंने 1960 की दिहाई में कहा था कि 5 रुपए मन है आटा और उस पर भी है सन्नाटा. So when the price of atta went up to ₹5 per mon, then there was a huge hue and cry that the price of atta has gone so high, has become so high. Imagine what the price of atta today is. it's around 400 rupees for the same quantity of atta. So the increase in prices, you can imagine, has been like from 5 rupees to 400 rupees. That's an 80 times increase in the price of wheat. Think about it. Have wages risen by the same amount in Pakistan as well? What was the wage of, let's say, a starting lecturer in the mid-1960s? Must have been around 300, 400 rupees. What is it today? Might be about 6,000, 7,000. If you're very lucky, you might get 10,000. Those are only increases of 20 times or 15 times. Compare that with the 80 times increase in prices, and you will immediately see how there has been a real erosion of purchasing power of the salaried class in Pakistan, and the same phenomenon holds in many other developing countries. Now, when I mentioned that if the real wage of salaried people in an economy goes down or deteriorates, that can manifest itself in adverse ways. That is, it can lead to major inefficiencies in the public sector. People are not motivated to work. It can also lead to bribery and corruption, and people have to find other ways to find sustenance for themselves. So these are all the negative repercussions of when the price inflation is higher than wage inflation. So in a way, we've already started talking about the costs of inflation, which is the next step in our discussion today. So let's formalize our discussion about the costs of inflation. The first cost that I want to talk about is related to what I was just mentioning, and it is about redistribution of wealth from salaried classes to the landed or asset-owning classes of the economy. Now, the increase in prices of goods usually hurts the salaried classes most, especially if those salaried classes, jo tankhadar tabqa hai, they do not have the bargaining power to renegotiate wages in line with the rate of increase in prices. So they have to settle for whatever they get from their business firm owners or from the government, if you're talking about the public sector. But on the other hand, if you think of how the asset owners, the landed elite, the owners of property respond to price inflation, also the business sector, the shop sellers, the shopkeepers, how do they respond to a rise in prices? Well, if they see prices rising around them, they will simply raise the price of land. They will simply raise the price of their goods. So they are not as badly hurt as the salaried classes are. And this results in a redistribution of wealth and welfare in the economy from the salaried classes to the landed classes, or those people who have assets whose prices are quite sensitive to the rate of inflation. So that's one of the major costs that inflation brings to any society. The other cost is that of uncertainty. When the rate of inflation is very high, then it is very difficult to predict what the change in inflation rate will be or what the change in prices will be in the next period. So the higher the inflation rate, the more the uncertainty about the direction of prices or the rate at which prices will change in the next period. Often the inflation rate fluctuates more when the inflation is quite high. So if the inflation rate is, let's say, 2%, then it might go up to 2.5% or 1.75% or 3%. But when it's about 25%, then it could go up to 35%, 45%, or come down to 15%. And this introduces uncertainty. And uncertainty is something that really affects the business sector, firms, industries, businesses, businessmen, who have to make decisions about future investment, about what they're going to produce in the next period. And they often have to take account of the expectations they have about where prices will be in the next period, because they have to plan their cash flows accordingly. They have to, if they are uncertain about the revenues that they will make or the costs that they will incur, then they can't be certain about the profits that they will make. And therefore they will be hesitant to invest. They will be hesitant to expand capacity. They will be hesitant to start new projects. And this will naturally result in a retardation of activity and growth in the economy. So the economy would not grow as fast as it could if this uncertainty was not there. Now, those were two costs of inflation, two more costs. The first is the effect that inflation has on the balance of payments. Now, we haven't talked formally about the balance of payments, but we have talked about exports and imports and the effect that price changes, relative price changes, can have on the value of exports and imports of an economy. So think of the scenario in which, let's say, our price, the price of Pakistani goods increases. This will render our goods less competitive or less attractive for foreign buyers. So foreign buyers will no longer buy our goods because they have become more expensive, because the price is rising very fast. So Pakistan will not be able to export as much as it used to do earlier. Similarly, the effect on imports will be the opposite. That is, because the local goods have become more expensive, people will switch to imports from other countries which are still cheaper, and therefore your import bill will go up. So note that your exports are falling and your imports are rising. What is the cumulative effect on your trade balance? If you remember what the trade balance is, the trade balance is simply the exports minus imports. And the trade balance is one of the most important components of the balance of payments. So when trade balance deteriorates because exports are falling and imports are rising, it has serious consequences for your overall balance of payments. And we will discuss the particular problems that that can pose for any economy. Finally, when you have inflation in any economy or high inflation in an economy, there is a lot of resources which are wasted. So think of firms and businesses trying to guard themselves against rising prices. They hire consultants, they hire accountants, they hire financial experts, which then guide firms on how they can guard against the risks of rising prices. Think about price lists that have to be issued. New price lists have to be issued every day. So if you go to a restaurant and the restaurant gives you a menu and there are some prices of different dishes on it, if the price inflation is very high, then the restaurant will have to revise that price list every other month or every 2 months. So next time you will go, there will be a new menu. So these menu costs and all this is a wastage of resources. Think of what individuals themselves do when prices are rising. They are constantly worrying about how they can get a cheaper deal, how they can buy something cheaply, how they might wait and maybe prices come down, how they constantly worry about the rising prices and how they will manage in future. Then think about also if real wages are falling, people think about other ways, devious means to make money. Sometimes people go into gambling and trying to make quick money. So all sorts of negative use of the resources that the economy has and the resources that individuals have. There is wastage of time, wastage of energy, wastage of talent. And these are all attributable to the high inflation prevailing in the economy. शायद यही वजह थी कि हज़रत अली अलैहिस्सलाम जब बता रहे थे कि किसी भी मुल्क के अंदर सबसे बड़ी प्रॉब्लम्स क्या हो सकती हैं, तो उन्होंने कहा कि बदतरीन हुकूमत वो है कि जिसमें चीज़ों की कीमतें तेज़ी से बढ़ती जाएं और लोग रात को चैन से सो ना सकें. So law and order was one major problem that he identified, and price inflation was the other. So important is the problem of inflation. So my friends, by concluding that small discussion on the costs of inflation, we can now move to an investigation of the causes of inflation. And as we saw in the unemployment case, that there are 3 possible theories on the causes of inflation. But the categorization is not quite the same. There we had the Keynesian theory about unemployment, the classical or real wage theory about unemployment, and the monetarist theory, which was the natural rate of unemployment theory. Here we have 2 of those parties present. We have Keynesian theories about inflation. We have the monetarist theory. But there is a new third species, which is not strictly classical, and we'll refer to it as separate. Now, the 3 theories about inflation are basically demand pull inflation, which is an example of Keynesian inflation. There is a cost push inflation, which is this neutral category that I can't put a name on. And there is this third category, which is the quantity theory explanation for inflation, which is given by monetarists led by people like Milton Friedman. Let's start talking about these individual theories and whether the reasons that they identify are valid or not, or in which particular circumstances do they hold. Let's start by talking about Keynes's demand pull inflation. And let's start talking about what the Phillips curve is. We'll need to go back to the aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph for this. So let's start by straight away going to that graph. Now, as you can see in this graph, we have the traditional aggregate supply curve, which is horizontal up till point O, which is the full employment level of output. And beyond that, it is upward sloping. And this is a typical aggregate supply curve in a Keynesian sense. Now, we are only interested in points after O. That is, we are not interested in the horizontal part because any change in aggregate demand will not increase prices in that region because the AS curve is absolutely horizontal. So let's think about what happens when the aggregate demand in the economy increases as we move along points O to C. So let's say the aggregate demand curve shifts from AD1 to AD2. That is, we move from point O to point A. The increase in output is equal to the distance A, whereas the increase in prices, the correspondent increase in the price level is A prime. Now let's have the same increase in aggregate demand, that is the same distance from AD1 to AD2, that is we now move the same distance from AD2 to AD3, the same horizontal distance. What is the new equilibrium point that we reach? We reach point B. And the distance, the horizontal distance covered in terms of output is now B, which is smaller than A, but the corresponding increase in price on the vertical axis is B prime, which is greater than A prime. Similarly, if we move from B to C by a final injection of demand, that is from AD3 to AD4, then you can see that the increase in output is this small c, whereas the corresponding increase in price in moving from B to C is C prime, which is bigger than B prime. Now, there are two things about that graph that I want to mention. The first is that as you increased aggregate demand, there was an increase both in the level of output and in the price level. That is, the price and the output were moving in the same direction. That is, we had a positive A, then a positive B, and a positive C moving towards the right. And then similarly, we had positive A prime, B prime, and C prime all moving up. But the second and probably more important point here was that with each increase in aggregate demand, the output effect of the aggregate demand injection became less and less, and the price effect became higher and higher. That is, A was greater than B, was greater than C on the horizontal axis, but A prime was less than B prime, was less than C prime on the vertical axis. That is, the rate of increase in prices became higher as the economy moved further and further away to the right from the full employment level. And this is because of the curvature of the aggregate supply curve. Note that the aggregate supply curve is not a straight line. It's an upward sloping line which becomes more and more vertical as we move away from YF. Now, this graph that I have just drawn to you is the graphical representation of demand pull inflation. But what does it mean intuitively? Well, it does not mean much. It's a simple theory which we talked about in microeconomics as well, that as the demand for a good increases, its price would increase. So if the overall demand in any economy increases, the prices of goods and services will increase. It's as simple as that. But note that in my lectures on the introduction to macroeconomics, I mentioned that Keynes looked at unemployment and inflation as opposite sides of the same coin, right? If you remember that, he said that if inflation goes up, that means unemployment is going down. If inflation is going down, that means unemployment is going up. So a period of recession would be characterized by low inflation and high unemployment, whereas a period of boom would be characterized by high inflation and low unemployment. How does the relationship between inflation and unemployment formalize? How can we formalize that relationship? Well, the name of that relationship is the Phillips curve. Phillips was the name of an English economist who formalized this relationship between inflation and unemployment. Note that the analysis that we just looked at, which was the aggregate demand, aggregate supply diagram, was in price output space. You had price on the vertical axis and output on the horizontal axis. But if you want to understand more directly the relationship between inflation and unemployment, then you need to do something about the axes. I mean, you can still have prices or inflation on the vertical axis, but you need to change the horizontal axis to unemployment. And this is exactly what the Phillips curve does. The Phillips curve captures the trade-off between inflation and unemployment once the economy is close to or approaching or beyond the full employment level. Let's look at the Phillips curve and see what it tells us. Well, it's quite simple actually to change the axes that we earlier introduced, the P output axes, and make them inflation unemployment. Because all that you need to do is have a reflection of the first graph on top in the y-axis. So you will get something like this graph that is shown here. So the points O, A, B, C now move in a northwesterly direction instead of a northeasterly direction. And this obtains because we've reflected the AS curve in the y-axis. We've also replaced, for simplicity, the vertical axis by inflation. It was prices earlier, but now we've made it inflation, and we have unemployment instead of output on the horizontal axis. And this is obvious. This is because unemployment is the opposite of output. That is, in the ADAS curve, as you move further and further to the right, you are increasing output, but that is only possible if you are increasing the level of employment. So when you reflect this graph in the y-axis, then because you now have unemployment on the axis, on the horizontal axis, then as you move further and further to the right, then unemployment is increasing, but as you move further and further to the left, unemployment is falling. That is, as you move further to the right, the level of employment is falling, whereas as you increase further and further to the left, the level of employment is increasing. So as you can see, we now have the corresponding points O, A, B, C moving in a leftward or northwesterly direction, and we can draw the corresponding A, B, C increases in employment and the corresponding A prime, B prime, C prime increases in the price level or inflation. And the same relationship, as you can see, now appears as an inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. Now, the reason why this curve, this inflation-unemployment relationship is called the Phillips curve is because W.A. Phillips, the UK economist who gave this the name, actually plotted the figures for UK, the figures for inflation and unemployment for the UK in the 1950s, and the trend was seen to persist in the 1960s. He plotted these on a graph, and this is the curve that he obtained. Now, these are hypothetical figures, but it was something similar that he obtained, and this is why the curve was called the Phillips curve. So all he did was he took the inflation unemployment figure for 1959, put it there, the inflation unemployment figure for 1955, 56, 57, 58, 60, 61, 62, and he just put these different points on the graph, and he drew the best possible fitting line in the middle, and this is the inverse relationship that he got. And this was consistent with the Keynesian view of demand-pull inflation, that is, inflation which is caused or pulled by the level of aggregate demand in the economy. So that, my friends, was the Phillips curve. It captured the trade-off between unemployment and inflation. When I say trade-off, it meant that if the policy makers wanted to reduce unemployment, then they could not do it unless they were willing to increase inflation. So if the policy makers wanted to generate more jobs or reduce the level of unemployment, then this could only be done at the expense of higher inflation. This is what was called the unemployment-inflation trade-off, and this is what Keynes meant when he said that inflation and unemployment are the opposite sides of the same coin. Now, the implications for policy or how to correct for such inflation, that is demand-induced or demand-pull inflation, were simple. And the implication was that the demand management should be done in such a way that inflation is not taken too high. That is, you can't reduce unemployment so much that inflation goes up very high. This trade-off had to be balanced very carefully in order to ensure that the costs of higher inflation were not greater than the benefits of reduced unemployment. So it was a cost-benefit analysis approach that the solution to this type of inflation was put forward. That is, the solution was a cost-benefit analysis approach given this trade-off. Now, this is one type of inflation and the theory about the causes of inflation that was put forward. And this remained dominant till the 1960s, and the Phillips curve was seen as very stable not only for the UK, but for a number of other countries. Now, come the 1970s, and this was the end of the Phillips curve or the Keynesian demand pull inflation, the power of that explanation to explain all types of inflation. The 1970s saw rising inflation not because of excessive demand. As I've mentioned before, in the 1970s we had the oil price shocks and the world was in recession. So there was a lack of demand. Yet inflation was rising. So people could not understand how high inflation could go together with a recessionary phase, that is low unemployment. That is, how could stagflation exist? So they questioned the typical Phillips curve argument, which connected inflation and unemployment in an inseparable way. And the argument given was that it is possible to have another type of inflation, which is called cost-push inflation. That is when the shock is not the demand shock. That is, it is not the demand increase or decrease which is causing inflation or deflation. It is the changes in the aggregate supply curve which can cause changes in prices. And let's see how this could be reconciled within the Phillips curve setup and the ADAS setup. Let's go to our graph. So here we have the price quantity graph. The aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves are plotted. Note that we have now omitted the horizontal part of the Keynesian aggregate supply curve because it's no longer relevant. We are talking about that part of the aggregate supply curve where the inflation unemployment trade-off exists. Now let's think what happens when the supply shock takes the aggregate supply curve from AS to AS prime. That is the oil shock, the rise in the oil prices. It shifts the AS curve inwards, equilibrium moves from E to E prime, output moves from Y to Y prime, and prices rise from P to P prime. Note that nothing has happened to aggregate demand, but yet prices have risen. So how do you explain this in the context of the Phillips curve? When you plot the data for the 1970s and also for the 1980s, for many of these countries, these developed countries, on the inflation unemployment graph, you get things like this, right? All these points that you cannot draw the Phillips curve through. That is, the Phillips curve that you have is inside, whereas the points are outside the Phillips curve. And this is what led to the decline of the simple or stationary Phillips curve hypothesis. That is, there is just one stable Phillips curve that any country can have. But the argument that some economists gave was that the Phillips curve is still relevant. It is just that the trade-off has shifted horizontally over time. That is, the trade-off was represented by PC1 in the 1960s and 50s, but the trade-off now is represented by PC2. That is, there has been a structural shift in the trade-off. And now if you draw PC2, it can help explain some of the points that were earlier not possible to explain through PC1. Note 2 points in the context of what we've just discussed. The increase in prices, that is inflation in this case, was not caused by any demand factor. It was caused by a shifting of the aggregate supply curve or a shifting of the inflation unemployment trade-off. The second thing is that once the stability of this trade-off was called into question, that is, economists said that there was no single trade-off relationship between unemployment and inflation, or at least it was not stable, the ability or powerfulness of the Phillips curve explanation for inflation was called into question as well. That is, people wanted some other theory that could explain inflation a little bit better. Similarly, the policy implications, the suggestions that were given were also different. In our next lecture, my friends, we will talk about these other policy suggestions other than the demand management policies that Keynes suggested when he gave the demand pull inflation theory that could be employed to tackle cost push inflation. We will also look at the other type, the third view on inflation, which is the monetarist view, which is related to the quantity theory of money. So things are getting more and more interesting, but maybe a little bit more complicated as well. See you next time, inshallah. Till then, Khuda Hafiz and Assalamu Alaikum.